Welcome to episode 132 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue with Epicurus' letter to Pythocles, and we look at the implications of the Epicurean position on certain weather phenomena. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
Earthquakes may be brought about both because wind is caught up in the earth, so that the earth is dislocated in small masses and is continually shaken, and that causes it to sway. This wind it either takes into itself from outside, or else because masses of ground fall into cavernous places in the earth and fan into wind the air that is imprisoned in them. And again, earthquakes may be brought about by the actual spreading of the movement which results from the fall of many such masses of ground and the return shock, when the first motion comes into collision with more densely packed bodies of earth. There are also many other ways in which these motions of the earth may be caused. The winds may be produced when from time to time some alien matter is continually and gradually forcing its way in, or owing to the gathering of a vast quantity of water. The other winds arise when a few currents of air fall into many hollow spaces and cause a spreading of wind. Hail is produced both by a powerful congelation, when certain windy bodies form together from all sides and split up, also by a more moderate congelation of watery bodies and their simultaneous division, which causes at one and the same time their coagulation and separation, so that they cling together as they freeze in the separate parts as well as in their whole masses. Their circular shape may possibly arise because the corners melt off all round, or because at their conformation, bodies, whether watery or windy, come together evenly from all directions part by part, as is alleged. Snow may be produced when fine particles of rain are poured out of the clouds owing to the existence of pores of suitable shape and the strong and constant compression by winds of clouds of the right kind. And then the water is congealed in its descent owing to some conformation of excessive coldness in the clouds in the lower region. Or else owing to congelation in clouds of uniform thinness, an exudation of this kind might arise from watery clouds lying side by side and rubbing against one another, for they produce hail by causing coagulation, a process most frequent in the atmosphere. Or else, owing to the friction of congealed clouds, these nuclei of snow may find occasion to break off, and there are many other ways in which snow may be produced. Dew may be produced both when such particles as are productive of this kind of moisture issue from the atmosphere and meet one another, and also when particles arise from moist regions or regions containing water, in which dew is most naturally produced, and then meet together and cause moisture to be produced, and afterwards fall back on the ground below, as is frequently seen to be the case in phenomena on Earth as well. And frost is produced by a change in the dew particles, when such particles as we have described undergo a definite kind of congelation owing to the neighborhood of a cold atmosphere. Ice is caused both by the squeezing out from the water of particles of round formation and the driving together of the triangular and acute angled particles which exist already in the water, and again by the addition from without of particles of this kind, which when driven together produce a congelation in the water, by squeezing out a certain number of the round particles. The rainbow is caused by light shining from the sun onto watery atmosphere, or else by a peculiar union of light and air, which can produce the special qualities of these colors, whether all together or separately. From it, as it reflects back against the neighboring regions of the air, can take the tint which we see by means of the shining of the light onto its various parts. The appearance of its round shape is caused because it is perceived by our sight at equal distance from all its points, or else because the atoms in the air or those clouds which are derived from the same air are pressed together in this manner, and so the combination spreads out in a round shape. A halo round the moon is caused either when air is carried towards the moon from all sides, or when the air checks the effluences carried from the moon so equably that it forms them into this cloudy ring all around without any gaps or differences, or else when it checks the air around the moon uniformly on all sides so as to make that which encircles it round and thick in texture. This comes to pass in different parts either because some current outside forces the air or because heat blocks the passages in such a way as to produce this effect.
Okay, Martin, thank you for reading that for us today. We have a relatively long section here of meteorological phenomena like hail and snow and dew and ice and rainbows. And then we get a little bit towards the end about the halo around the moon. And we also started off by talking about earthquake and how the air might be involved in that as well. So this one has one or two references to the question of how we think about it or the epistemology angle, but there's just a lot of direct observations about things going on in the sky. So who would like to start? I guess the best way to attack this is probably going to be just to see what catches somebody's eyes about any of these paragraphs that you'd like to talk about. Starting out with the first section on earthquakes and how they happen. Anybody have a comment on that?
I wonder if either of you have ever experienced an earthquake. I've never actually experienced one, I don't think.
I experienced them almost monthly during my time in Japan. But that,
Okay. Yeah. You would, wouldn't you? Yeah.
I was never close to a strong one. So while I was there were two strong ones, but they were far away. So I felt them as weak ones. But what made them different from the local weak ones is that there were two parts, because there are different types of waves and they come with different speeds. So when I noticed this, that there come with that there are two groups of waves coming with a time gap in between, then I could guess there must have been a very strong earthquake far away.
Certainly there are people in the Pacific Rim for whom this will be a natural feature of life. And if it is a natural feature of life, it's clear why this would be an important issue for you. I don't know really the history of Greece and their tectonic activity, but certainly they were aware of it in these times, because one of the attributes of the god Poseidon is earthquakes, which we don't think of that. We think of him as being the god of the sea, but they seem to have made some connection between earthquakes and what's happening in the ocean. And that is exactly true, that we know that to be true. I think this is partially why Japan often has flooding, and that is because you get a tectonic shift out in the seabed, and then that starts it ruffling, and then by the time it hits land, it's built up considerably. Or at least that's my understanding of how it works.
Yeah, just to give an impression, I mean, you probably are familiar with the vibration which come when the truck passes by or a railway. No? So, and these earthquake vibrations, they have a lower frequency. So that means they go more slowly, but the amplitude you feel to be higher. But unless they are very strong, they don't make you feel panicky about it. So I met people who actually liked them. So it gives you a feeling as if the Earth is alive.
That's very interesting. The only time the ground shakes where I'm at is when they're blowing stuff up on the Air Force Base.
What is strange today is that he links air to it. No? So I guess it's something, because rock is normally something considered as static, no? It doesn't move, and air and water move. So I guess this is a reason that he felt it necessary that somehow wind is involved in this one, because you normally on an earthquake on land you wouldn't see water to be involved. And then in order to have some movable force, he introduces this idea of his air, which is mostly, of course, nonsense. So, but within his idea of just coming up with explanation, then this one is okay. And he himself says, no? Because he doesn't know what the actual cause is, he just gives this as a possible explanation. There are also many other ways in which these motions of the Earth may be caused. So that means he also then will accept it if they are completely different things. The one way where he is right is, I mean, of course, there are these big earthquakes and also, of course, a spectrum of smaller ones, which are caused by the movement of tectonic plates. But collapse of caves, if there's a lot of ground above them, that may actually cause earthquakes as well. So that means that part of it he got right, but that he again attributes wind to be then there's something of importance that is not convincing.
There's a cave, Martin, in South Dakota, which is adjacent to the state I grew up in, which is Iowa. And in South Dakota, on the western side of it, I guess in the southwestern corner, there is a cave called it's Wind Cave National Park. And I've been to Wind Cave, which is it's a very I quite like going to caves. Not in any technical spelunking sense, but I just like touring them, as it were. And this cave has an interesting backstory because it has, as the pressure in the atmosphere changes, it will force air into the cave, and the cave is so huge. I don't even think it's fully explored, but it's so huge that, and I think it only has one known entrance, if I'm remembering that correctly. And so you've got pressure in the atmosphere goes up, it forces this air into the cave, and then when the pressure in the atmosphere goes down, you've got this huge, huge quantity now of pressurized air that's in the cave. It's not high pressure, but it's roughly the pressure that the atmosphere was before it changed, and now it has to rush all out again. And the classic story that they'll tell you if you go there is the guy who discovered the cave, when he brought his friends back, he took his hat off and he threw it at the entrance, and he was expecting wind to blow out of it because that's what he thought was happening. He thought wind was blowing out of the cave, but the pressure had reversed since the last time he was there. He threw his hat at the opening and it sucked it into the cave. And so now he's got to go inside and get his hat back. So I can see why this association between caves and wind would come about, and I can see why, if you're in an area with rocky outcroppings and there's harsh wind, you get this whistling and that kind of thing. I could certainly see why this explanation would come about, despite what we now know, of course, is that it's to do with tectonic activity in the Earth's crust, I guess.
Yeah, that is the most common mechanism for probably the vast majority of earthquakes in a sense.
One thing I want to talk about a little bit later is this building that I went to when I was in Athens called the Tower of the Winds. Certainly from a mythological point of view, each of the winds was associated, of course, with a deity. And so the association of different winds with the different seasons kind of reinforces that idea. If in spring the wind comes from the west, which is what Lucretius suggests in the Hymn to Venus, then you could see how it kind of almost has, where it's easy to attribute something like a personality to that. I don't think that's what Lucretius is doing, far from it, but that does, I think, play into so much of how the Greeks thought about the world that they lived in. I think, though, that in terms of atomism, the argument has been made, and I think we're probably going to get to it here, which is that even though you can't see atoms, I think Lucretius makes it explicit. One of the ideas that we know that there are atoms is because when you think of wind, which is, you think of it as essentially being nothing, there are videos that you can find on the internet if you look, that are people even today who will point to things like the tide, for example, as being evidence that there is a God putting it all into motion. The tide goes in, the tide goes out. You can't explain the tide. Well, in fact, we can't explain the tide. That's not really a problem. But I've seen this also with the wind. They'll stand outside, hold up their arms and goes, "Do you feel that? It's the wind. What is the wind? The wind is God." That kind of thing. So it's refreshing to read a text like this that just doesn't reach for those absurd explanations. It reaches for natural explanations. Even if it fails to find the right one, it still made, Epicurus, Lucretius, these guys, they still made a step in the right direction rather than taking a step in the wrong direction. And it's very easy today to find people who are more wrong than these guys were.
Yeah, Joshua, that's really the overarching point of everything we're discussing about today. We don't have a text this week because it's already been said many times in the past that the reason we're doing this is we're looking for natural explanations, in part so that we don't have to worry about the gods being the source of it. So we're in the middle of this discussion, but that's the underlying context. Everything we're saying is written in that framework of showing naturally occurring causes that relieve our minds if we're concerned about the fear that maybe the gods are doing these things, and that the gods might decide to push us around just like they would push around the winds and the earth and the hail and the snow and the dew and all that. Okay, and with that, I'll say that we then turn to hail, and then after that, snow.
Yeah. Since we are on the topic of wind, let me talk a little bit about this very interesting building that you can find in this area, what they call the Roman Agora in the city of Athens. And what you find there is this very interesting building, or it was interesting to me. called the Tower of the Winds, or the Horologion of Andronicus Chairestes. Andronicus of Cyrus, or of Cyrus, was the guy thought to have been the designer of this building in around 50 BC, although it might possibly have predated him, might have been as early as the 2nd century BC, having been built before the Forum. They're not quite clear on that. It's a really interesting building. Let me just tell you a little bit about it. The Tower of the Winds is 12 meters or 39 feet tall, has a diameter of 8 meters or 26 feet, and in antiquity it was topped with a weather vane in the shape of a triton that indicated the wind direction. And then below the main frieze, I guess you have, no, not below the frieze, on the frieze, right below the sort of top of the building, right below the roof, you have depictions facing the right direction of the 8 wind deities. You have Boreas, the north wind, Caecius, the northeast, Hepeliotes, the east wind, Euros, the southeast, Notus, the south, Levas, the southwest, Zephyrus, who is mentioned by Lucretius in the opening to his poem, the west wind, and Sciron, the northwest. And then it had 8 sundials, and it's considered to have been, interestingly enough, the first meteorological station. So this is why it's interesting for what we're talking about. The name horologion comes from what we would call today horology, or the study of how we keep time. And I found this building so interesting because it also had something I mentioned on the podcast before. It had a clepsydra. Thanks to Don for correcting the name after I couldn't remember it last time. A clepsydra, or water stealer, water thief, was a very primitive clock they use. So they have this structure made out of marble in the shape of an octagon, and it had sundials, it had a weather vane, it had a water clock. So there's an attempt here to understand how these things happen. And even though you've got depictions of the gods on each side of this building, the building itself is a testament to something different and something new. And I think that this is something that Epicurus himself could have envisioned doing, is if we're trying to understand meteorology and how it happens, we're trying to understand the winds, maybe you could propose that the thing you need to do is just measure them over a period of time. The other thing we've talked about is that the ancient Greeks weren't very good at coming up with experiments to test their conclusion. But this is an example of an attempt of mankind to come up with something like a standard measure and then apply it to nature. And of course, Greece, as a seafaring civilization, it matters quite a lot what's going on in the sky. So anyway, if you have a chance to get to Athens, go see the Tower of the Winds. It's in quite good shape, and the frieze is still there.
Yeah, Joshua, that is something totally new to me. While you were talking, I Googled it. When was this built?
In 50 BC or sometime between 100 and 200 BC.
So after Epicurus, sounds like around the time of Cicero and so forth. So like you're saying, it's a tower structure. It appears to have an inside. What's inside of it?
There was a mechanism inside for keeping time using water, believe it or not, because what you got to realize is they had sundials, which work, but you need a way to keep time when the sundial doesn't work. In other words, when it's too cloudy for the sundial to work, when it's nighttime, they had to find a way. This is located in the Roman Agora. They had to find a way to regulate time because, this is how civilization works. You have to, things are set to a clock. Generally.
Wow, that's very interesting. And like you say, it's octagonal with, like you said, a depiction of, I didn't know the Greeks had a name for the gods from each direction. So I guess you're saying 8. So we've talked about earthquakes and wind now to some degree. And we're moving on to ice and snow and hail as the next topics that are picked up. Anything on those?
I guess I'm always trying to relate this back to some kind of personal experience. And some of the weirdest weather that I used to see when I lived up north was hail. And it can come out of nowhere. It can come out on a apparently sunny day. The size can be quite large. It causes significant damage both to vehicles and to crops and to roofs. And as in all cases, I'm wondering what if they're talking about this in Athens, then this is something that they must have experienced in Athens. I don't know if you get hail in Athens, but when you experience it for the first time, I talk to people who have never seen snow now that I live in Florida. It's such a weird thing for me, of course, because I grew up with snow, with hail, sleet, with roads so thickly crusted with ice that you can't even drive on them. And so this is it. This is such a feature of life in northern climates. And for people who haven't experienced it, it's like someone who's never experienced, the rainforest going to that. And I guess it's something that when it happens to you in certain ways, it can almost seem uncanny, I guess would be a word. And that can get people thinking in terms of, the unnatural or the, what's the word? The divine, I guess.
Yeah, just like the gods are throwing rocks at you, basically.
Yeah. I can distinctly remember a time, and I know exactly what road I was driving on when this freak hailstorm came out of nowhere. And I got home, and I had gotten a text message from one of my friends who was also driving in the area. They said, "Is the world ending right now?" Because it's such a weird, uncanny thing to happen when you're not expecting it.
Yeah, my family my son grew up only in Thailand, basically, and his mother, of course, was Thai. I think she also didn't experience hail yet. So once when we visited Cologne and we were walking outside, the hail suddenly happened. He was happy running around in it, like playing, trying to catch it, things like this. And then, of course, his mother was a bit worried whether this may cause injury. But then the hail was so small. I thought the small grains of hail are not the big ones.
Yeah.
They come they cause really damage. I saw cars which got damaged by almost X-size hail pieces of hail.
Yeah, my car has hail damage on the top of it. It was that way when I bought it, but it was actually quite good for me because the price was significantly less with hail damage than it would have been otherwise. So roofs, and then in the Midwest, it's the crops in particular.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If the hail gets big enough, because if it just beats down the corn stalks, then that's it. That's it for that harvest. Just about. It's not good.
I think it's even mentioned as a plague in the Bible, no?
Seems that way to me too.
That's a good point.
Is it one of the plagues of Egypt?
That's what I'm looking up right now.
No, not sure it's whether it's among those, but at least I think I remember it that there was some mentioning of hail.
Yeah, the plagues are water turning to blood, frogs, lice, flies, livestock pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the killing of firstborn children. So that gives you an idea, doesn't it, of hail and how people think about it and what it presents to people when they see it, maybe seeing it for the first time. It's on the same list as pestilence, boils, and the killing of the firstborn child. I mean, this is apparently something that people took rather seriously.
Yeah, but I think because of crop damage. Because at that time, where we didn't have this easy trading that you can compensate local crop loss, at that time it would mean famine. No? So I think the hail themselves was not a concern for them. It was really that the crop damage.
That's a good point, because Egypt under the Roman Empire would sort of go on to become, I guess, more or less the breadbasket of the empire. You could take so many grain ships out of there to feed an army. Snow was also a feature of my life growing up. And one of the things that was a feature of my parents' life growing up is that the actually snowstorms in Iowa have gotten a lot milder since they were young. And of course, you have to allow for embellishment. But my dad would tell me stories about waking up on the farm and then having to dig a tunnel to the barn to feed the animals and that kind of thing.
Wow.
At 4 a.m. They had these machines to go down these rural roads. And it was a snowblower, but it was a huge truck, and it would actually shoot the snow straight out the top, and then the wind would carry it off the side of the road. And so by the time you get done there, you've got this, essentially the road is a tunnel now with snow just stacked up higher than your car on either side. And I've experienced that too. I was driving truck at this place on the border of California and Nevada called Donner's Pass. And it gets so much snow there. This is one of the more dangerous trucking routes in the country. It gets so much snow there that the rest area on the side is actually just completely buried in snow. They've got to dig out the door. Otherwise, you would totally be lost under snowdrift. And of course, at this time, you have to think in terms of what was their ability to control the temperature in their houses. Certainly they had no real way of making things colder, which is shocking in itself to many people, but they also had certain limited ways to make their homes hotter. Certainly you could maybe start a fire. If you're in one of these luxurious Roman villas, you'd have what they call the Hippocaust, I think is this underfloor heating system that would heat the whole home, and it would be rather comfortable to live and to walk on. But it's, I guess, difficult when you're at a lower economic status in these times to really do much about it.
I mean, what I read, at least for some period, not sure whether this applies ancient times, so at least for some time in the past, they built houses with very thick walls. And this would take then heat a long time to really get inside. And it also would make it easy that you have a fireplace in the house to keep the house rather warm in winter.
Yeah. And of course, in these Roman villas, they had the architecture of the house itself would allow because they've got the peristyle and in the first room, and then you go into the what's the back room called? It's got the big central garden with the colonnade around it, and then the roof is open, and the peristyle typically is open as well. And I think in the peristyle, you've usually got like a reflecting pool. And so what this allows is that the hot air that comes into your house wants to go up. So it'll go up through the roof, and then it's now pulling heat out of those walls. So the walls themselves, in a sense, are acting as a heat shield, and then the hole in the roof, which is, I guess, counterintuitive, putting a giant hole in your roof to cool things down, but it absolutely worked.
Did the Greeks do it the same way as the Romans did?
Yeah, I don't know much about Greek home construction.
But coming back into this effect you mentioned, I think the bigger effect of this one is simply that you have wind going through your house. So that means it's something like the effect you get nowadays from a fan. So that nowadays from an electrical fan, that you have the air moving, and that then cools your skin down better. So I think it's not so much cooling of the house, but rather producing movement of air.
And then if you've got water involved, you get evaporative cooling, which is the oldest human cooling method that there is, which is also how sweat works.
Dew or ice?
Don't know that I have a whole lot to say about
dew
or ice.
Yeah, I mean, what we should mention here that this idea of triangular and acute angle particles which exist in the water, and then that round particles get squeezed out, that really doesn't make sense. But I mean, of course, in the context of just coming up with a natural explanation at that time, without having a better explanation directly at hand, it seemed to make sense.
Martin, what do you think about cryogenic freezing after someone dies? You shove them in a freezer and then expect to be able to revive them at some future point. I'm curious to hear what your opinion on that would be.
That is nonsense. So people are duped into something like this. It's very unlikely to work. The biggest issue we have even there, I mean, even though that in some way you can make the heart pump again, and in some way restarts the brain low. If you could overcome this, you have a much bigger problem before that. Because when you warm up the body, then different tissues have different temperatures of where the water will melt. No? And that means those structures which are still ice. No? And then these ice crystals, they can have these, what's actually mentioned here with these sharp, these acute angles. No? So they can be very sharp. So they will damage the already soft tissue where the water is molten. That means the different organs of a being like a human will be quite mushy. No? So they will no more work well. Probably once you get it then up and you start pumping, then you will see that there's a lot of internal bleeding in the body everywhere. No? So it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's been my sense as well. Yeah, because first of all, there's never been a case in the medical literature of a human coming back from brain death. We think of death as being, when the heart stops or they stop breathing, but it's really brain death that is the end of who you are as a person. And even if it turns out to be reversible, as you said, the process by which they're trying to accomplish this, and that's what I've always heard as well, is these ice crystals that are very sharp as they come into contact with tissue, they just cut right through it.
Yes, as we record this in July of 2022, that used to be a topic that was discussed, seems like a lot in sort of the popular or scientific literature. I haven't seen as much discussion of that in recent years as it was perhaps when we were younger.
Yeah, because the tech freaks came up with something what seems better than this. The idea of transhumanism via computers, no? So that the idea is that essentially you upload your brain onto a computer and then you continue living as that computer.
I saw something the other day which I thought was quite funny, and I assume this is just a joke on the internet, but someone was offering post-rapture dog walking services. If you pay a subscription fee today, then when the rapture happens, we'll come get your dog and we'll take him out for walks. So this kind of thing is, it's such a difficult thing to talk about. People are so firmly entrenched when it comes to issues like death and what happens when you die. But I think that for an Epicurean, you've got to accept that death is inevitable. It is coming. And it'd be great maybe if it wasn't going to come, but you can't rely on that. And in so much of your peace of mind relies on you having the right mindset about this, because it's going to define how you approach every day of your life. That's how I got from ice to death. That was my
Yeah, and that takes us back to the main reason we're doing all this discussion is that these meteorological phenomena are somewhat interesting on their own, but Epicurus has always been very clear that the reason we do these studies is to assist us with peace of mind issues, and not only just making sure that we don't believe that there's a supernatural cause for them, but I don't know that we have a lot of the texts that go in this direction, but surely you get a lot of practical benefit out of understanding these things and have the ability to improve your day-to-day life. Joshua, you were talking about how you design your houses to deal with temperature changes and the weather and so forth. So there's clearly a practical side in addition to just knowing that these things occur naturally and not supernaturally. Well, the last one that is listed here today is the halo around the moon.
Well, hold on. Before we got that, we
Okay.
should talk about the rainbow.
What do you think about rainbows?
No, I quite like rainbows, actually. But particularly what I wanted to talk about is this poem by John Keats, which we mentioned Richard Dawkins last episode, I think. And he's got a book called Unweaving the Rainbow, which I have not read, but it comes from this poem by John Keats. The poem is called Lamia, and John Keats was known to complain about people like Isaac Newton and his work on optics for taking things that were interesting and wonderful in nature and reducing is not my word, but I think it captures the general idea, reducing them to mere scientific understanding. And the idea is that it takes all the romance, all the fantasy out of nature. And that's not my position. If it was, I would not be an Epicurean, but this is what he has to say. He says, philosophy, meaning I think natural philosophy, will clip an angel's wing, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and nomad mine, unweave a rainbow as it erstwhile made the tender-personed Lamia melt into a shade. So he's complaining here that natural philosophy, or what we would now call scientific inquiry, that when you subject it to things like, are there gnomes in the garden, or is the rainbow, is it a sign from God, or how does it come about? Is it magic? The idea is that when you subject these things to scientific inquiry, you take certain value away from them, value in human culture or in human emotions. Now, I decisively reject that view of things, but this is what John Keats writes. And I think that there are people who don't want explanations to things that seem fantastical, because so much of what they believe and how they perceive the universe hinges on things like not understanding a rainbow and believing that there are gnomes at the bottom of the garden or at the bottom of the mine. And so this seems to me to be critically important, something we probably should talk about, because I think Epicurus absolutely took the opposite position. He absolutely wanted to understand nature. He wanted to know what was going on. And he wants to use nature as a sort of tool to explain to people how they should think, not just about nature, but about other things as well. And so you've got, I guess, poetry on one side, which we know Epicurus didn't like poetry. and then you've got natural science or natural philosophy on the other side.
Joshua, that's the point I was going to raise, is Epicurus's well-known statement that the wise man is not going to write poetry, but I think it also continues, though, that he's the only person who can properly deal with it or understand it or something like that. And there does seem to be this connection between poetry and religion, in a sense, this flights of fancy. I think in our discussions of Frances Wright's A Few Days in Athens, she talks about the imagination getting carried away. I wonder if that's not what we're talking about to some degree here when we talk about the poetic side of things. There's this imagination and romance and mystery, this feeling of those things that is clearly a real feeling, but can lead you in the wrong direction if you allow it to just run wild without keeping in touch with the senses and the things that you can verify through your senses. So yeah, I see a common thread in what you've just raised there. And how do you prevent yourself from getting carried away by that emotional, romantic side of experience? I guess that's sort of a subtext of a lot of what we talk about. In very practical terms, it probably is the senses that you have to keep constantly making sure that you can validate what you're thinking and what your opinions are by the evidence of the senses. But your feelings also are an extremely important part of life. In fact, the feeling side of things is, I think you could make an argument, is the real heart of life. In fact, saying that reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's head versus heart letter, when he goes back and forth discussing the opposite directions he's torn when he goes with the heart and emotion speaking to him, as opposed to what he might consider to be a more logical approach to something. But I've always found it interesting that my reading of that letter indicates that Jefferson himself comes down very sympathetically, if not completely, on the side of the heart. That, again, these feelings that you have, the emotional response to life, is maybe the largest and most important part of life. Tricky subject.
It is, and there's also a case where these aren't necessarily in conflict. We put them in conflict because of our preconceptions or the assumptions we make beforehand about rainbows and what causes them. But a rainbow in itself can be beautiful without also needing to be mystical or supernatural or fantastical. It doesn't require that. The rainbow is lovely in itself, and it doesn't need that pedigree, that divine pedigree, to remain beautiful. And so much of nature is like that. And Epicurus loved to study nature. He thought it was so critical. He urged it upon his students. So I find it hard to believe that taking the alleged magic out of nature, when in fact you're actually getting to understand nature better than you did before, I have a hard time imagining how that's a bad thing.
Yeah, we're on the same wavelength there, Joshua, because I was thinking too about that. I think that's why Epicurus advises the study of nature, is because it does allow you to appreciate these things that you see around you without getting warped by them or getting carried away with the idea that they might be supernatural. The wonders of nature is kind of a cliche. It's so common to be impressed by natural scenery, of big, little, you can get fascinating. It's almost equally, if not more so, fascinating to look at small things and use microscopes and so forth as it is to use telescopes and going in larger direction. And so the more you immerse yourself, the more you practice the idea of seeing these very inspiring sights or fascinating sights, the more you see them, you can presumably get more used to the idea that these are all just natural. That's, like you said, a very important point.
Yeah, and I would contrast that, I guess, with what we talked about earlier with this Tower of the Winds and this very early approach to try to hold a ruler up to nature, to measure it, to figure out how we can subject it to a system. And I don't think that the Tower of the Winds is any less beautiful for that. And I think that understanding nature is interesting in itself. You think that you came out of nature and that you are, unlike so many other creatures on the earth that we live on, you are endowed with the faculty that allows you not only to emerge from nature, but to understand nature in some small way. We probably don't understand everything about nature, but one of the ways this has been phrased is that the human mind is nature aware of itself. That's an interesting concept, that you don't get cognition until you get a brain, or at least that's what I think, certainly, is you have to have the right combination of matter and energy in a particular configuration in order to get consciousness and cognition, and that nature doesn't have that until you have an organism or a mechanism capable of producing it. And so nature that gave us the pine tree that I'm looking at also gave us the eyes that are looking at the pine tree. And if you don't find interest in that, and you'd rather cling to this idea that, the rainbow is a promise from God, and I just don't know what to say about that.
Joshua, when you use that analogy right there, you could almost get me started on this topic of ultimately what is the motivating force of wanting to remain alive. It's almost as if when you describe the pine tree and you think about how poets will describe nature in very flowery or emotional terms, people seem to think that there's a conflict between that and science or just rationality. And it seems to me that the emotional response that you get from nature or from everything that you do, presumably, the emotional response to life, the pleasures and pains that come from the things that you're doing, I don't want to use the word purpose necessarily, but that's the very definition of being alive, almost according to Epicurus, is death is the absence of sensation, and all good and evil comes to us through sensation. And I constantly refer to, there's this phrase in Diogenes Laertius that the wise man is going to feel emotion more deeply than others, and that's not an obstacle to his wisdom. The depth of feeling that we ought to get from the things that we're doing is really why we're alive. And there should not be considered to be a war or a tension between those feelings of emotional response. And like I said, the science, the study of nature is not being done to numb ourselves to the emotional response to get from nature, but to allow us to channel it in the right directions and to continue to experience it. And there's not a war, there's not a necessary war or tension between those, it seems like.
There's something else I wanted to add to what you said, which is that I totally agree with you when it comes to the emotional, this deep emotional response that we have to life and to everything that we see in life, and that in itself is a reason to go on living. And there's another thing that I want to point out here, which is that it's not just the emotions, but it's also learning new things about life and about nature, about people, about culture, about language. That learning new things is also its own reward, in my view. That's how I feel about it. And certainly, I guess I could put it this way. When I was driving an 18-wheeler, the guy I'd gone to school for a month to learn how to do it. And then I got hired with a company, and they put me with this trainer for an additional, 8 weeks or something like that. One of the things he told me was, the day that you stop learning new things out here is the day that you need to quit. Because when you think that you know all the answers, and we've been hammering this home, but when the day that you think you know all the answers is the day you become, in a sense, dangerous. Because that's when you become enamored of the single cause, and you don't want to examine your own assumptions, and you don't want to examine what you think you know is true. And certainly the stakes are elevated when you get into a situation where you're driving a 40-ton vehicle, but it's every day the stakes are elevated in that way. And that learning new things not just gives you more knowledge about how nature works and people and civilization and stuff like that, it also, I think, or at least for me, it gives me a deep sense of pleasure to know more and to study more and to learn more. That's not a conflict with anything you said. I just wanted to expand on that.
Right. Not in conflict. And that's the important point, is that the learning you're talking about is, I guess it's kind of like the philosophy that Epicurus talks about in the Letter to Menicius, that you gain pleasure in the very action of doing it. It's not that you're just adding another book to your bookshelf. You're actually finding that knowledge to be pleasurable to gain at the time you're gaining it. And learning new things is, there's learning new things as opposing to learning the same thing over and over. I suppose it is possible to have certain types of knowledge that just really begin to bore you to the tears and that you don't gain any pleasure out of. But especially when you use the word new things, new indicates that you gain pleasure from that's the variety issue there that is mentioned in Epicurus as well at times, that at a certain point in life, additional variety may continue to be enjoyable, but it really is not necessarily adding anything to a full pleasurable life. And so at some point you don't cry too much about eventually dying because you've lived a full life as you've lived the normal human lifespan. But gathering knowledge in itself is generally pleasurable. And again, there's no conflict there. Is there anything about the halo of the moon that strikes you as relatable?
Hard to say, really. It's you can't observe this. I don't know if people notice this or not, but when you look at the moon, there does tend to be this sort of diffused light immediately forming sort of a ring around the moon. I don't know that I have a whole lot to say about it, though.
I think I never saw it. I checked it up how it looks. So because you need to have certain conditions there, you need to have ice crystals there in the air around the moon. And if you don't have that, you just won't see that halo.
Okay, this is very different from what I was imagining. I'm thinking if you look at, and maybe this is just my bad eyesight, but when you look at the moon, and particularly on a cloudy night or very, very light clouds where you can see the moon, but you see it's sort of foggy maybe, and it forms almost like, it's similar to looking at a street sign almost. You get this weird halo around it, but it's nothing at all like the pictures I'm seeing online. So
yeah, there's some very dramatic. If I wasn't on top of this either. I see what you're talking about, Joshua. If you look up halo of the moon, you see there's this 22-degree halo. Are you seeing that 22-degree reference?
Yeah. Now, what we called these up north were sundogs, and I have seen sundogs many times. So if you look up sundogs, I've never seen it on the moon, but certainly on the sun. If you look up pictures of a sundog where you've got, it almost forms an imperfect circle. When I've seen them, you don't see the circle. You just see the central real sun, but then you also see two false suns at a certain distance on either side.
Yes. So we're not just talking about the general fuzziness around the edge of the moon itself. We're talking about something that almost looks like the rings of Saturn or something, a dramatic, wide circle with space between it and the sun. Is that what you guys are seeing in these pictures?
Yeah. And when you mention ice crystals in the atmosphere, that certainly is the only time I've ever seen sundogs is when it's very cold. And of course, I grew up in Iowa, so that happened quite a lot.
That's interesting. Now that you pointed it out, Martin, I didn't realize that there was such a dramatic phenomena, but that makes it more understandable as to why it's included here. He's not talking about just a ring of fuzziness around it. He's talking about a very dramatic, noticeable circle around it. We'll definitely want to put a link or a picture in the show notes there because I've never realized that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. When you look at these pictures online, you do see the semicircle. In my experience, what I've actually seen is two vaguely bright spots on either side, but there's no observable connection between the two of them. So if that's what this passage is about, then I'd have to, I guess, read it differently because that wasn't what I was imagining. But it is a very interesting phenomenon when you see it for yourself.
Yeah, and worthy of inclusion here if it's so dramatic.
And I think that here, as in the case of the rainbow, it's going to come down to issues like refraction, that kind of thing, where you obviously there's just no way in ancient Greece to come up with ideas like that. So I wouldn't expect Epicurus to know what causes a rainbow really. And I see him attribute it to the motion of air or heat or stuff like that, it's not surprising to me. It also doesn't, the system does not stand or fall on whether he was right about the rainbow, because as we've talked so much about with the letter to Pythocles, it's so much more about the methods of these detail issues and how you study them and how you approach them. It's so much more about the method than it is about the conclusion, or the one word would be hypotheses. But the causes that you offer up that would explain it are, I guess, less central to me than the method that defines how you explain it or how you approach it and try to explain it. So we will have to put some pictures of that in the show notes. We'll put the Tower of the Winds in the show notes so people can read more about that. I found it very interesting.
Right. And we'll come back next week to complete some more observations about the stars and so forth. But he'll wrap it up with a discussion of the reasons why we're doing this again. So we'll have some more of the epistemology discussion for next week. And then we'll be at the end of the letter to Pythocles and we'll move on to something else. But for purposes of today and bringing today to a conclusion, let's go ahead and think about concluding comments for today. Martin?
Oh, I have none.
Joshua, anything else for today on these particular meteorological phenomena? Or anything else you'd like to bring up, actually.
Oh, I used to work at a deli, and it was sort of a very small, very family-owned sort of affair, kind of off the beaten track. This is in Sioux City, Iowa, where I grew up. And one day, this strange group of vans pulled into the park. There were like 3 or 4 vans pulled in, and this whole group of English people, or I guess people from the United Kingdom, tumbled out of the vans and came into our deli, which is something that doesn't happen every day in the Midwestern United States. You don't get tour buses full of English people showing up. So it was kind of an interesting event in that respect. I'd already been to England at that point, but it was such a weird thing to see these people sort of pile up, as it were, on our doorstep. And when we got to talking to them and asking them about what they were doing there, because it's not it's not a town on anyone's list, really. But it turns out they had started in Texas, and they were, as the English would say, they were holiday makers, but their pursuit really was they were storm chasing.
Huh.
So they'd come over to the United States for the interesting meteorological interest to be had here. And they had started in Texas, and they were just chasing this storm essentially up I-29. Then that's how they got to my city I lived in, which is on I-29. And that's how they found the restaurant that I worked in. So I found that just fascinating that people would travel those kinds of distances to come over here and then to chase these storms and then wind up in front of me at a deli that I work at in Iowa. I found that just fascinating. And it gives some idea of the interest that people have in these things, even though I think we've been struggling a little bit to talk about weather and the phenomena of the sky and of earthquakes and rainbows and that kind of thing. There is a real interest to be had here, and it particularly for people who want to experience things that maybe they haven't experienced before, things like hurricanes, tornadoes, huge piled up thunderstorms. If you want to experience a blizzard, for example, and you've never seen snow before, this almost becomes a reason to travel in its own right. And we talked a little bit last episode, I think, about how the weather affects cultures and the way that people interact and temperaments and things like that. And so it's inseparable from the identity of a place is its weather. And I just found it so interesting that people would come over here to look at our thunderstorms, which for me were such a common occurrence they weren't even worth remarking, upon.
And when we describe it as being weather, it kind of trivializes almost. That's like looking at the evening news to see whether it's going to be raining and how cold it's going to be tomorrow or something like that. But these are huge life-changing events. I mean, you get hit by a tornado, you get hit by a hurricane, you get hit by an earthquake, you get struck by lightning. You can be dead very quickly or have whole cities, regions wiped out by these events. And so it gets up close and personal when these things happen, and you naturally lead people to want to know, well, why did this happen to me? Why is this going on? Again, we have largely, with our air conditioning in our houses and so forth, we've largely got to the point where we almost ignore what the weather is outside. Especially over the last 2 years, we've been spending so much time inside with the COVID situation. And you almost can think that you've taken control of the weather and it's not even significant to you what the weather is going to be from day to day. But that is absolutely not the case in general. So it's very easy to default back and wonder whether these are actions of God, that he's sending some punishment to you by the way the weather operates. So I guess it's good that we have gotten to the point where we can ignore the weather as much as we do. But nevertheless, it's important that when we do come into contact with it, we understand it and we get acclimated to this general issue of, are the things around us caused supernaturally or are they natural? Are we at the whim of a God that we need to go out and sacrifice for to make the rains come? Do we need to learn a dance in order to bring the rains? All the different cliches that you can throw out about pleasing or displeasing the gods so that they'll send favorable weather to you. That's one of the major ways humanity has fallen into this course of looking for supernatural explanations for things that are natural.
Cassius,
okay.
I'm gonna put into the show notes this video that if people want to know about why people might cry out for God when something in nature happens. It's called the Lake Penier disaster. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the video is I found it so compelling. I'd never heard of this, but it's got a lot of different elements. It's got human failure. It's got insane things happening in nature, complete revolutionary changes in the eco or the micro environmental area of this lake, and it's so interesting and so fascinating. If you want to talk about, hear things in something like there's this story from Rome about the ground opening up and just swallowing things. And when you watch this, you'll come to some kind of understanding, I think, about how people emerge with that conclusion. But of course, the video will actually explain the very natural and human and artificial reasons why it happened. But when you see what happens, it's quite startling.
What is the general issue? What happened to the lake?
Okay, so you've got a salt mine. They were mining this salt dome that was under a lake. That had been going on for some time. So there's multiple levels of this, pulling out this sort of salt rock. The problem is it can't get wet. If it gets wet, it will collapse. So they have to keep water out of there. Separately, years after the mine was opened and was still fully running, they found signs because of the salt dome that there might be oil under the lake. And so they put a drilling rig out there. Okay, the problem is that the drilling rig hit the mine. And when it hit the mine, the lake water started to go into the mine. And when the lake water went into the mine, it mixed with the salt and the whole cave system, the whole architecture of this mine. Because when you dig it out, of course, you leave pillars in place to hold the ceiling up. That all just completely dissolved. And in a matter of a few hours, the entire lake, including the drilling rig, several barges, some boats, I don't think any houses, but the entire lake drained. It just got sucked into the earth.
Oh, my gosh.
And there was a canal going from the lake to the Gulf of Mexico. As I say, this happened in Louisiana. The flow of the canal reversed, and now you've got seawater rushing in and pouring into this lake that has completely drained itself. And I think by the time they went to bed that night, the lake had completely drained itself into the salt mine, and then it was fresh water. It had completely drained itself of fresh water, and then it had completely refilled itself with salt water.
Wow.
Or brackish water. It's absolutely mind-blowing, this video.
And when did it happen?
I think it happened in the 80s, but I'm not sure. It was completely new to me. I had no idea about this. In fact, the guy that I work with, who's been living in this area for a very long time, he didn't even know that this had happened.
Huh.
I'm going to recommend that anybody who even sounds interested in the earth swallowing an entire lake, you're going to want to watch this.
Okay. And we probably shouldn't close out without mentioning Mount Vesuvius and the explosion that is so important to all of our recollection of some of those texts as well, as another example of the life-changing events of nature and how those things happen without being driven by the gods. Well, okay. Any last words for today?
I almost, you mentioned Mount Vesuvius. It's so interesting to me because people to this day will use phenomena in nature to say, well, this is punishment for our sins and that kind of thing. And so I can imagine that for a volcano to erupt, and of course it caused horrible things to happen in 79 AD when this happened. The side effect is that it preserved the largest collection of papyrus scrolls from antiquity, and they were all to do with Epicurean philosophy, which explicitly denies any intervention of the gods in human or natural affairs. So there's a twist of irony there.
It sure is. Okay, well, we've probably come to the end of a normal length episode, so let's go ahead and close it out, and we'll be back in another week, and we'll finish the letter to Pythocles. So with that, we'll talk again soon.
Very good.
So I'll say bye.
Thanks, everybody.